A senior Biden national security official walks into a classified briefing at the Pentagon. The slides are titled Overmatch. For years, that word has been shorthand for America's military edge, the comfortable gap between what the United States can do and what any adversary can answer with. But this briefing is different. As the data rolls across the screen, the official turns pale. "Every trick we had up our sleeve," he later tells a colleague. "The Chinese had redundancy after redundancy." That was 2021. The man sat with that knowledge for years. And then, in late 2025, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said something no Pentagon chief had ever said publicly: "We lose every time." Every time the United States runs a classified war game simulating a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the outcome is the same. America doesn't win. That single sentence should rewrite how you think about geopolitics, about technology, about the balance of power that has underwritten global stability for 80 years. Because what the Pentagon is now admitting isn't a temporary setback or a budgetary shortfall. It is a structural collapse of military primacy that has been decades in the making, and that the United States may no longer have the industrial capacity to reverse. Here is how the most powerful military in human history found itself outgunned, outbuilt, and outmaneuvered by a country that, 20 years ago, couldn't put a decent aircraft carrier to sea. The Overmatch Brief is a multi-year assessment produced by the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment, its internal think tank. It wasn't meant for public consumption. When the New York Times revealed its existence in December 2025, it set off a chain reaction that is still reverberating through Washington, Tokyo, Taipei, and Beijing. The brief's conclusion is blunt. In a conflict over Taiwan, U.S. forces would most likely suffer decisive defeat. Not a Pyrrhic victory, not a stalemate, defeat. The reasoning is surgical. Distance and time now favor China. American forces would need to surge thousands of kilometers across the Pacific, while Chinese forces would fight from under a protective umbrella of layered missile defenses, dense sensor networks, and overwhelming firepower. In military language, the PLA has achieved what strategists call integrated joint force maturity, the ability to coordinate air, sea, land, space, and cyber operations so tightly that they can impose catastrophic losses in the opening minutes of a conflict. Minutes, not days, not weeks, minutes. The Overmatch Brief describes a scenario where Chinese ballistic and cruise missiles saturate U.S. defenses simultaneously, striking air bases across Guam, Okinawa, and mainland Japan. Runways cratered, fuel depots ignited, hardened aircraft shelters shattered. In multiple simulation runs, up to 90% of U.S. and Allied aircraft positioned at forward bases are destroyed on the ground before they can get airborne. And it gets worse. The U.S. space architecture, all those satellites responsible for communications, missile warning, GPS navigation, and intelligence collection, would be degraded within hours by Chinese anti-satellite weapons, both kinetic and electronic. American forces would be fighting blind for the first time since the Second World War. But the Overmatch Brief was just the appetizer. In January 2026, the Heritage Foundation released TIDALWAVE, the most ambitious AI-enabled war simulation ever conducted outside government. Using over 7,000 open-source data points, the model ran thousands of iterations tracking how losses in platforms, munitions, and fuel compound over time. The Trump administration was so alarmed by the findings that senior national security officials asked Heritage to redact portions before publication. What survived the black ink is terrifying enough. The U.S. would reach its breaking point, the moment its forces become incapable of sustaining operations, in less than half the time it would take China to reach the same threshold. Critical precision-guided munitions, the long-range anti-ship missiles, air-to-air interceptors, and missile defense systems that form the backbone of American combat power begin running out within 5 to 7 days of major combat operations. By day 35 to 40, they are completely exhausted. Fuel, the report finds, is the most decisive vulnerability of all. The US doesn't run out of fuel in most scenarios. It loses the ability to move fuel under fire. Chinese doctrine explicitly prioritizes attacks on logistics vessels, ports, pipelines, and replenishment tankers. Even limited tanker losses are sufficient to drive fuel throughput below survivable levels, forcing commanders to ground aircraft and anchor ships, despite aggregate stockpiles still existing somewhere in the supply chain. Meanwhile, China endures far longer. Chinese ammunition stockpiles begin depleting after roughly 20 to 30 days, but substitution effects and sheer volume extend their combat capability for months, well beyond the point at which American forces have already collapsed. The economic fallout modeled by TIDALWAVE is equally staggering. A global shock estimated at roughly $10 trillion, nearly a tenth of global GDP, driven by the destruction of Taiwan's semiconductor industry, the disruption of shipping lanes, and the collapse of financial confidence across every major market on the planet. A senior Biden official turned pale reading a briefing. The appropriate response to TIDALWAVE might be something stronger. Understanding how America arrived at this precipice requires looking at two things simultaneously: what China built and what the United States let decay. Start with shipbuilding. In 2024, China built over 1,000 commercial vessels. The United States built 8. That ratio isn't a typo. According to U.S. Navy intelligence data, China has 232 times America's shipbuilding capacity. One Chinese shipbuilding company, a single company, has built more commercial vessels by tonnage since 2020 than the entire U.S. shipbuilding industry has produced since the end of World War II. This industrial dominance translates directly to naval power. China now operates 370 warships. The U.S. Navy has roughly 290. But the raw count understates the gap. 70% of Chinese warships were launched after 2010, compared to just 25% of America's fleet. China's ships are newer, and the Office of Naval Intelligence has assessed that they are increasingly of comparable quality. And behind those warships stands a reserve force that no Western Navy can match. Beijing can surge up to 5,500 hulls, including Coast Guard vessels, merchant marine ships, and dual-use civilian craft for logistics, transport, and refueling. The United States has roughly 80 comparable auxiliary vessels. In a prolonged conflict, attrition favors the side that can replace losses. China replaces losses. America mourns them. The missile picture is equally grim. A CNN investigation using satellite imagery found that over 60% of China's 136 known missile-related facilities showed signs of active construction or modernization since 2020. These factories, research centers, and testing sites have collectively expanded by more than 2 million square meters. One factory in Beijing, which grew by nearly 50% in 5 years, produces the DF-26 medium-range ballistic missile, known in defense circles as the Guam Killer, a weapon capable of changing trajectory mid-flight to evade interception, with enough range to strike the U.S. Air Force's Andersen Air Base. China is also adding roughly 100 new nuclear warheads per year, the fastest nuclear expansion of any nation on Earth. Now look at the American side of the ledger. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the workhorse of U.S. long-range strike capability, are being consumed faster than they can be manufactured. In fiscal year 2025, the Navy budgeted for 72 new Tomahawks. In fiscal year 2026, that number dropped to 57. Each missile takes up to 2 years to produce. Yet in recent operations alone, the U.S. has fired over 135 Tomahawks at Houthi targets in Yemen, roughly 30 at Iranian nuclear sites during Operation Midnight Hammer, over a dozen at ISIS targets in Nigeria, and an undisclosed number during Operation Epic Fury against Iran in March 2026. As Mackenzie Eaglin of the American Enterprise Institute put it, during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, the U.S. launched roughly 800 Tomahawks in the initial invasion. At current production rates, replacing that salvo alone would take a decade. A war with China would require far more. The missile defense interceptor situation is even more dire. During the June 2025 Israel-Iran war, the U.S. expended 92 THAAD interceptors at approximately $12.7 million each, roughly 14% of its total stockpile, in just 12 days. If Operation Epic Fury continues at a similar pace, THAAD usage could reach roughly 1/3 of the entire U.S. inventory. And then there is the air superiority question. In late 2024, China publicly revealed the J-36, a tailless 6th-generation stealth fighter that analysts describe as a flying command center. The aircraft reportedly operates above 65,000 feet, giving it a literal high ground over the F-22 ceiling of about 59,000 feet. It likely carries the PL-17 missile with a range exceeding 245 miles, more than double the reach of America's best air-to-air weapon, the AIM-120D, at approximately 100 miles. China's J-36 is already in advanced flight testing. Its American counterpart, the F-47, remains largely on the drawing board. The procurement system that was supposed to prevent this gap is itself part of the problem. U.S. weapons production is concentrated in 5 major defense companies. Shipbuilding depends on essentially 2 firms, Huntington Ingalls Industries and General Dynamics. The workforce has atrophied. Demand signals from Congress fluctuate wildly year to year. The result is a defense industrial base that one Congressional Research Service analyst describes as structurally brittle. China, by contrast, has aligned its doctrine, its industry, and its political will toward a single strategic objective: defeating U.S. intervention in a Taiwan contingency. While Washington debated procurement cycles and congressional earmarks, Beijing built. The PLA calls its approach system destruction warfare. The concept is elegant in its brutality. Rather than defeating individual American platforms one by one, collapse the entire operational system simultaneously. Blind the satellites, crater the runways, sever the fuel lines, jam the communications. When every node in a networked military depends on every other node, destroying a fraction of them causes disproportionate paralysis across the whole. America's military was designed for exactly this kind of network-centric warfare. That was supposed to be its strength. China studied that architecture for 20 years and built a military specifically designed to shatter it. The 2026 National Defense Strategy, released in January, acknowledges the challenge in carefully bureaucratic language. The SimSec analysis is less diplomatic. If a war erupts over Taiwan, what will sink the U.S. Navy first? Chinese missiles or American shipyards? The honest answer, based on every available data point, is that American shipyards might be the bigger threat. You cannot replace what you cannot build, and right now, America cannot build fast enough to matter. Every data point above would be alarming enough in peacetime, but the United States is not in peacetime. It is actively engaged in military operations against Iran, and those operations are accelerating the very munitions crisis that makes a China conflict unwinnable. 40% of U.S. Navy ships are currently deployed to the Middle East. The only aircraft carrier in the Pacific Theater is under maintenance. Japanese officials have privately asked Washington for assurances that U.S. military resources will remain in place in Asia. They haven't received them. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who ordered the Overmatch Brief studied, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby, spent years arguing that the U.S. must preserve its munitions stockpiles for a potential war with China. Last July, he paused a weapons shipment to Ukraine for exactly that reason. And then, his own administration launched 2 successive military campaigns against Iran that are draining the exact stockpiles he fought to protect. Current and former defense officials within U.S. Central Command have warned of a Winchester scenario, military shorthand for complete ammunition depletion. Kelly Grieco of the Stimson Center put it simply: we are using munitions faster than we can replace them. Asian allies see the pattern clearly. A Taiwanese lawmaker warned that prolonged instability in the Middle East could embolden Beijing to increase pressure on Taiwan. Reports from Tokyo indicate that Japan is already experiencing delays in receiving U.S. missile orders. South Korea is nervously watching its alliance partner stretch itself across two theaters, while China watches from across the strait. And China is watching, quietly, methodically, with the patience of a power that has studied its rivals' weaknesses for decades, and now sees those weaknesses compounding in real time. Beijing doesn't need to defeat America militarily if American strategic overextension does the job for free. As one strategist noted, China's calculus involves patience, allowing what it views as American strategic incoherence to degrade Pacific deterrence through capability dispersion. Every Tomahawk fired at Iran is a Tomahawk that doesn't exist for the Taiwan Strait. Every interceptor expended over the Persian Gulf is one fewer standing between a Chinese missile barrage and a U.S. carrier strike group. China announced a 7% increase in military spending this year, alongside a 5-year plan to reduce its military's reliance on Western technology. Beijing has been helping arm Iran with CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles, YLC-8B anti-stealth radar, and access to its Beidou satellite navigation system, a military-grade alternative to GPS that is resistant to Western jamming. Russia has provided Iran with Su-35 fighters, S-400 air defense systems, and orbital reconnaissance through the Kayam satellite. The strategic picture is clear. America's enemies are cooperating, its allies are anxious, its arsenal is depleting, and the Pentagon's own simulations say it would lose the one war that matters most. RTX Corporation, the manufacturer of Tomahawk missiles, announced this month that it will work to increase annual production to over 1,000 missiles per year. That sounds like progress, but context obliterates the comfort. The CSIS wargame from 2023 estimated that a Taiwan conflict would require the U.S. to fire up to 5,000 long-range missiles in the first 3 weeks alone. At 1,000 per year, rebuilding after even a brief conflict would take half a decade. And that's assuming production lines aren't disrupted, supply chains aren't strained, and the rare earth materials that go into precision guidance systems, many of which come from China, remain available. Here is the number that encapsulates the entire dilemma. Each Tomahawk cruise missile costs approximately $1.3 million and takes up to 2 years to produce. Each Chinese DF-26 ballistic missile, the one designed specifically to destroy the bases from which those Tomahawks would launch, costs a fraction of that and rolls off an assembly line that has expanded by 50% in 5 years. The math is not complicated. It is devastating. The Pentagon produced a 2026 National Defense Strategy that calls for relentless innovation, rapid adaptability, and a willingness to discard old assumptions. The problem is that assumptions are cheap to discard. Aircraft carriers, $2 trillion fighter programs, and a shipbuilding industry that hasn't been competitive since the Cold War are not. Some analysts point to potential solutions: smaller, cheaper, more numerous platforms, corvettes, frigates, unmanned surface and underwater vessels, alliance integration with Japan and South Korea, whose shipyards could help close the gap, a shift from exquisite, low-density weapons to mass-producible alternatives. These ideas exist. They have existed for years. What doesn't exist is the political will to implement them at the speed the threat demands. Elbridge Colby, the same official who tried to preserve Pacific munitions, wrote the intellectual framework for the 2018 National Defense Strategy that identified China as the pacing threat. 7 years later, the pacing threat has become the leading threat, and the arsenal democracy that won the last great power conflict is struggling to produce enough missiles to fight a regional war against a middle power in the Middle East. In 2005, the United States had such overwhelming military dominance in the Pacific that the idea of China threatening Taiwan was almost abstract. China had a small missile arsenal, no real blue water navy, and a fighter fleet a full generation behind. 20 years is not a long time, and yet, in those 20 years, the balance of power in the most strategically consequential body of water on Earth has not just shifted, it has inverted. The question is no longer whether the United States would choose to fight for Taiwan. The question, according to the Pentagon's own classified assessments, is whether it could fight and win at any acceptable cost. Ukraine showed what happens when a smaller nation defends itself with cheap drones and uncrewed surface vehicles against a superpower's conventional fleet. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was effectively neutralized by weapons that cost a few $100s to build. A $13 billion Ford-class aircraft carrier, the crown jewel of American naval power, is not immune to the same logic. Only the missiles pointed at it cost $250,000 instead of $300, and there are thousands of them. The Pentagon knows all of this. It has known for years. The Overmatch Brief existed in 2021. TIDALWAVE was released in January 2026, with redactions requested by the very government that should be acting on its findings. The J-36 flew publicly while the F-47 existed as a concept on a whiteboard. China built 1,000 ships while America built 8. And every week, more Tomahawks fly toward targets in the Middle East that have nothing to do with the strait that could reshape the century. The question that should keep you up at night is not what's in the classified reports. It's what those reports haven't changed.